Hey everyone, it's Para from the Paradox Brothers YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be making a video about the decks that could impact the upcoming GOAT Format World Championships in 2023. So to start now, I think we should talk about the story up until this point. So we're going to do that by looking at the events in the last year, starting with GOAT Format World Championship 2022. And in addition to that, we're going to filter our results utilizing the format library database and only looking at tournaments that have 100 or greater participants. The one exception to this being the GOAT Format World Championship 2022, which I believe had 77 participants. So let's start with this right here. This is Dingo Sig's Chaos Return deck that he used in the GOAT Format World Championship 2022 to win. He used a deck very similar to this in the 2021 championship to place, I believe, maybe 5th. It's a very good deck, a very uncommon deck, which makes it even better. It has a lot of the things that make any Chaos deck good with the BLS and the Chaos Sorcerer, but also has the Recruiter and the Shining Angel. More so just to maintain board presence than anything else, and to kind of take a, instead of having hand advantage, which this deck doesn't focus on, like Chaos Turbo does, it just focuses on having board presence while simultaneously getting cards banished utilizing your BLS, your Chaos Sorcerer, and in this particular deck lists the Bazoo. So it just creates game-ending plays, especially if you set a Death Tornado, you back row your opponent's back row with Death Tornado, and then use Death Tornado's secondary effect to set your return. Next turn, go into a Bazoo, attack, banish a bunch of monsters, attack, and then use Return for a Different Dimension just to win the game. It's very strong, and obviously it proved that by winning this tournament. Next is a GCI championship. This is a Panda Burn deck. The tournament had 136 players in it. This is a fairly standard Panda Burn deck with 3 pandas. Standard in the modern day, I suppose, because prior to, I think in 2021, I don't believe Delinquent's deck that won that tournament played Chain Energy. That kind of came later on, almost as a alternative way of playing the deck as soon as people started using Mr. Box and the side deck to kind of counter the main Panda Burn strategies. But outside of that, it's a fairly standard deck that you would come to see. Obviously, this player had a significant success with 136 players. I'd say that is pretty difficult to do with Panda Burn because you can counter it fairly easy in the side deck, but that doesn't mean it's not a good deck. Moving on, GOAT Format Championship 19. This is a Le Bounty's Warrior deck, and yeah, it's fairly standard with the exception of the Magician of Faith, which this player has kind of been the one who has innovated that integration of a flip effect monster into a warrior package or into a primarily warrior deck. There have been decks in the past that have used a small warrior package and some sort of other focused strategy like Go Control, for example. But I do think the one Magician of Faith being just a complete surprise to your opponent can be a really big deal, right? Because in most cases when you're playing as a warrior, you never expect them to set anything. Unless it's like a Mystic Swordsman they can't do anything with or something like that, or setting a Don Zug maybe, or DD Warrior Lady, something to that effect. But in this case, setting a Magician of Faith, flipping it, getting a Delinquent Duo back can just change the game. So I think it's really good, although I will say too many flips may be an issue at some point. But Chaos Turbo. This deck is something you should get pretty familiar with in this video because you're going to be seeing quite a bit of it, more or less, with the exception of like maybe, anywhere between like 6 to 8 cards most of the time are interchanged between decks, but for the most part, it's the same. Not much to say. Good deck, good player, obviously, to win a tournament of this size. Just because it is a good deck, it doesn't mean that it's an auto win. It takes a lot of skill to win any tournament with any deck, really. I will say Chaos Turbo can be quite forgiving, but playing against other Chaos Turbos in that mirror match can be quite difficult, and kind of reminds me of way back in the day playing Goat Control mirrors, in the sense that like that was the deck to beat at the time, and playing in the mirror, kind of how good you were in the mirror at that point in time kind of decided how often you would win a tournament. And in a way, that seems to be the case with Chaos Turbo, with the exception of being able to win the mirror, but also you have to be able to win the warrior matchup, which is probably its only um, negative matchup, or I wouldn't even say it's negative. They're probably even. They're both do things very good in their own ways, but if any deck were to counter a Chaos Turbo, it would be a warrior. So another Chaos Return deck, which was surprising to me. This was from the Format Library Championship 28, and using a very different strategy than Dingo 6 Shining Angel version. They use primarily dependent upon the banishing of monsters from your grave for the summoning requirements of the Chaos monsters. So 3 Chaos Sorcerers, which you don't see very often anymore. Except for maybe in Reasoning decks, but even in Reasoning decks, a lot of the times they're only playing 2. So they have 3, 1 BLS, and 2 Return. They also have some interesting, they have 1 Mystic Tomato, and 1 Newdoria, a Sangan to search. Obviously, they can switch into the Decorchis as well. They're still playing the strategy of playing 3 Decorchis, because you're going to play a flip monster, you can play 3 of them. Obviously, they don't play 3 of the Magical Merchant because they don't play that many light targets to begin with, so they want to have more light targets that are guaranteed to be in the grave with like Thunder Dragons, and also using Return on a Magical Merchant isn't going to produce much damage. So this is a very cool deck. Moving on, Format Library Championship 29. This is 111 players. AJT a very good player, a very known player in this community. I think this is anywhere between 20 to 22. In one case in this video, I think there'll be a deck that has 23 monsters, but that's generally what they look for. Obviously, they're edging towards beating Chaos Turbo mirror matches, but the Mind Control and the Phoenix Wing Wind Blasts, but overall, very standard deck. Warrior deck, as we said before, probably the only deck here that counters Chaos Turbo. That's at least a common deck. So this is a fairly standard warrior deck, the only exception being the upstarts and the Mind Control. Once again, trying to maintain board presence and just have your outs. I think they play upstarts because they're trying to draw into a lot of their Solemn Judgments, since Solemn Judgment is kind of a core of the warrior deck in a lot of ways. So moving on, FLC 30, Chaos Turbo. Very standard, very similar to the ones we saw before. I'm not really going to go into explaining it other than saying that the Trap Dust Shoots are in the main because of the mirror. Warrior deck, 2 Mystic Swordsmen. That's the kind of significant difference in this deck. I think outside of that, it's a fairly standard deck. This particular player plays a deck very similar to this pretty often, I'd say. Moving on, SDG Goat Italian Championship 2023. This is like another Chaos Turbo deck. This is the 23 monster count I was talking about earlier. The Mind Controls, the Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, they're obviously kind of going towards that Chaos Turbo mirror match. Outside of that, nothing really different to say. Moving on, Chaos Turbo once again. This Chaos Turbo, however, is a bit different. So they have the 3 Zombiras. Anthony Alvarado is the one who played this and kind of brought Zambara into the attention of the mainstream Go format, I guess, community, if you say. But it's kind of like a Gravekeeper Spy that you don't have to set. It doesn't really give you the same resource generation as Gravekeeper Spy, but it does allow you to have a board presence, right? Because Gravekeeper Spy is good for multiple reasons. Board presence, because it stays, adds another one, which creates even more board presence, and also gives you advantage. But Zambara is nice because people won't be snatch slaying him, can't be knocked because it's not face down, and it's good in that way. You can always sacrifice over him with a Thunder Dragon to get the necessary Chaos monsters. A lot of synergy there. Moving on, Chaos Turbo for FLC 31, Ivan Rosito. This is once again just a very standard turbo deck with just Mind Controls and Trap Dust Shoots to try to beat the mirror match. So that was it for the 12 decks that from the 12 events that had 100 or more participants. But also, I guess there were, including the one that didn't have 100 or more, which was the previous Goat Format World Championships. So now I'm going to be talking about the percentage of representation out of those 12. So to begin with, Panda Burn was 8.33%, which is kind of what you would expect because not a lot of people play Burn. Chaos Return, which was surprising to me, was 16.67%. I honestly thought it would be, in some ways, I thought it would be more because you'd think that Chaos Return would be more popular. But unlike in Chaos Turbo's circumstance, I don't feel like the popularity of this deck is going to equate to more victories. Because this deck is a lot less forgiving and a lot more difficult to win with. Not that I think it's any less good than Chaos Turbo. I think it's really, really good, especially if you're using it correctly. But I don't think the increase in usage is going to be proportional necessarily, and like the increase in victory, right? I will say though, the more people that play obviously a deck, the more often it's going to win if a good player is playing it. But I do think people will tend to drop it earlier on because it yields less results early on. It doesn't give you the motivation to continue using it. Unlike Chaos Turbo, you can get results fairly early. You don't often lose in pools if you're a fairly competent player. You usually only lose to people who are outplaying you in that matchup or just get more lucky than you. So in some ways I'm surprised it's not more, but this is kind of where I would expect it to be. Moving on. So Warrior, 25%. This makes sense to me because Warrior is probably the easiest to use deck to beat Chaos Turbo. Not that I'm saying Warrior is an easy to use deck. I actually think because of the limited resources you generate with Warrior, you have to be very conscious of the fact that you have limited resources and use them appropriately. You can't just spend them, like for example, Solemn Judging everything is just not a good idea. It's a very easy way to lose, like in 3 turns. And resource management is crucial to playing this deck. So unlike in Chaos Turbo where you have so many resources that I feel like players that are less skilled will discard cards that are suboptimal and still be able to win. Whereas in Warrior, you have to be very, even coming down and discarding off a Graceful can be a crucial decision. Discarding the wrong set of cards off a Graceful can really just lose you the game. So you have to be very conscious of that fact. So I don't think Warrior is as easy to use as people think. Moving on, Chaos Turbo. This makes 50% of the field. It also makes complete sense because it is a very good deck. It is very forgiving, and it creates early on returns, which motivates people to want to continue using it. And obviously, the more people play a deck, the more optimized it's going to get, etc., etc. The more content that's out there for people to look, and the easier it is for people to get used to using it. I also think in itself, the core of the deck kind of is the engine is very easy to understand and kind of is self-propagating once it gets started. You don't really have to, it's very obvious what you should be doing a lot of the time. Now it does get tricky in very high level games, and it requires a lot of skill to edge out your opponent in those games, especially if they're playing Chaos Turbo as well. So next we're going to talk about what could be next, like as in what decks that didn't make this list of the 12 list that 12 decks I just went over. What decks outside of that could you potentially see making an impact in Go Format World Championships? It's important to understand that while current decks that are being played and having success do have an effect on the population and what decks they choose to use, because people want to use decks that people are winning with because people want to win, which is totally fine. It's also important to understand that very high level skill players are going to understand that they need something to edge out their opponent. And playing long, stressful tournaments with mirror matches, like a lot of Chaos Turbo mirror matches, for example, can be quite exhausting, even if the deck isn't that difficult to use necessarily. It is very difficult to still win at high level play and does take a lot of skill to outwit your opponent, right? So what I'm getting at here is the element of surprise will help mitigate that issue quite a bit, to be able to just completely catch somebody off guard, right? So to begin with, this is Chris Perovic's deck that he played somewhat recently. It's interesting because he used Tributes and Warriors. Has always been kind of something that people said that you should never do, but in this particular deck, he did that, just that thing, play 2 Zaborgs, which makes sense because once again, you have the Spies, you have the Zombiras, you have the Spirit Reapers. Even there's probably a lot of the time he's getting the Zaborg out, and it's a big difference maker because the problem with Warrior decks sometimes is they don't have an enormous amount of like without BLS, without Sambaira, and mostly just BLS, they don't really have really like attacking monsters that are over 2,000, which can be a problem for like getting over spies, for example. But Zaborg gets over a spy, and they can get over another one by attacking. So also we'll say a special note for this deck, he has 3 spies and 3 mind controls. Mind controls are clearly headed towards the Chaos Turbo matchup, but it also makes sense to have the 3 spies in this deck because you don't have to be as spot on with your guesses on what your opponent is playing. You actually benefit a lot from getting a spy, unlike most warrior decks don't benefit whatsoever because most warrior decks aren't maining spy. But if you take a spy, flip it over, you get your own spy, then you have tribute fodder for the next turn for Zaborg, or even for that turn, I suppose, for Zaborg actually. So you could literally mind control, flip over a spy, get a spy, sacrifice a spy, play Zaborg. So in a meta where spy is probably the most common card outside of the staple spells, and traps, it's probably the most common monster besides like BLS or Sandkin or Sinister. It's up there in the top 5, probably top 5 to top 10. Most Chaos decks will be playing Spy, so it makes a lot of sense to have the 3 mind controls and 3 spies. Only other thing I'll say is that they're using the 3 Sakuretsu armors means they are respecting the warrior matchup. They're not just totally saying they don't care about the warrior matchup like you may think at first glance. They have the Spirit Reapers, which help you, the spies, which help you, the Zanbaira, which helps you, and the Sakuretsu, which help you. So it makes a lot of sense. This deck is very interesting to me. Sorry, I gotta clear my voice here. Moving on, one of my favorite decks that has been pioneered by Lafayette 2. As far as, at least to my knowledge, this was the first player to really play it. He's reinvented this deck over and over again, playing it in multiple different variations, winning in multiple different tournaments. In this particular tournament, I can't remember how many people played in it, but I did watch this on stream. It was very cool. Moving on, I think that Kolei Monarchs are very strong. That's one of my favorite decks. Just going into Cold Wave and Cyberstein or Zaborg or Mobius, it's just very, very powerful. There's not much else you have to really say about it. It's just your opponent can't play spells or traps for the turn that you're playing, so they can't react to what you're doing, and they can't set up for next turn either. So if you get a BLS, you run over their monster, attack them directly. They can't play any spells or traps next turn, so you could literally have another turn to use your BLS uninterrupted. It's just really, really good. Relinquished Control. This is a deck that was used to win the Chicago Grand Prix, and it's kind of like it's almost like in a lot of ways like a Chaos Turbo type of deck, because you have the Thunder Dragons, you have the Sinister Serpent, the Sangam, the Upstarts, but you also have the Relinquished and the Manjus. The Manjus, any system that you can have in Yu-Gi-Oh! Go format that allows a light to fetch a dark or a dark to fetch a light is very good. Because it's essentially turning on the chaos system immediately, and that's fantastic, especially if you're playing discard traps, right? So you have Manjus, and then Manju can fetch the Relinquished, and then you have the Phoenix Wing Blast to clear the board to go in for attacks, and to discard the Relinquished. It's very strong. I will say one thing as well, is card destruction is certainly qualifies as a 4th power piece next to the Trinity in this situation, because you can potentially discard a Relinquished or Relinquished a Sinister, 2 Thunder Dragons. You could just get a massive discard off this, and not only set yourself up for later Chaos plays, but just draw a bunch of cards, which is always really good. Another one of my favorite decks is the Cat OTK strategies, or Cat Burn, for example. I think that those are really quite fun. This deck is kind of classified as Cat OTK, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does a 1-turn KO as often as what you may think, as the name would imply. It wouldn't be surprised if it was they do a bunch of chip damage with Cat, then the next turn goes on, then they activate a bunch of trap cards to do the rest of the damage, or vice versa. Earlier in the game, they do a bunch of burn damage, then finish you off with Cat. Either way, combining Cat with burn makes total sense. I love that idea. I think it's a great idea. I honestly think it's probably the best type of burn or type of rescue cat strategies to incorporate burn into it. So but also, if you don't like the burn side of it, there's the Lafayette version that was in the same tournament, which I have in a previous video, where they didn't use any burn at all, and they did really, really well. So lots of ways you can play Cat. Reasoning Gate Turbo. This is probably the best deck that you're not playing right now. It's very strong. It can completely just overwhelm your opponent. They have no way of really interacting with it at times. At the same time, it can brick terribly. That being said, even though people do believe it's more like random than anything else, especially in tournaments where you're playing in a 2-day tournament, a deck list is public or something like that, it's not nearly as random as what you might think, because firstly, people will potentially know your deck list, and even if they don't know your card for card deck list yet, they know you're playing Rizike Turbo, and most of the monster lineup is very similar. I will say, they know what numbers to call. To a degree at least. So it takes a lot of skill to really set this up and to win the game with it. I mean, obviously you do get lucky sometimes, like you can with any deck, but you can't sit here and tell me that Chaos Turbo Opening, Thunder Dragon, Graceful Charity, Sinister Serpent, etc., Magician of Faith is not a absolutely broken hand to start with. There's all sorts of decks out there that if they get the right hand, it can just feel completely one-sided, and this deck is no different. But very fun, very cool. I like Rizike Turbo decks myself quite a bit. So this is something I can see people legitimately bringing to the Go Format World Championship and taking people out potentially. And the last deck I want to talk about is this one right here. So this is the Library FTK. For those of you who are not familiar with this, you're probably not familiar with it because it has been banned for quite a while. And the reason for the banning was because Compulsion of Nature on Dueling Book had an issue where when someone activated, they could inspect the elements and see every card in their deck in the order that it was in. And obviously that's unfair, right? So they banned it in Go Format tournaments, but recently that bug has been fixed, been confirmed to be fixed as far as to my knowledge. Therefore, this deck is now playable. I kind of lump this in the same category as like Dark Magician of Chaos launch, which is with the spell economics, mass driver, sort of situation where they just, burn you infinitely for damage if they get the right cards. This is kind of similar in that regard. The idea is, they pay a bunch of life points, or they, whatever, they have multiple ways to kind of get to their end game. But the idea of it is that they're going to, if they get the right cards, they will be able to be set up in such a way in which you never even get to move. The idea is like they reduce their life points down to like such a little amount, and they use a reversal quiz, swap each other's life points, and then black band it and win the game, or something to that effect. The Go Format channel actually on YouTube has a very good explanation of how to counter this. JDZ did a video because of its imminent return. And I feel like if you are playing the Go Format World Championships, you probably already have, but if you haven't, you should watch that video. And maybe you consider having a couple cards on the side to take care of it. Maybe ones that work against other decks, like King Tiger, for example. The main of this deck, as if you go first, the main of this deck doesn't really have doesn't have any way of taking care of King Tiger, right? And they can't really do anything about it. So, yeah, so that's something to consider. That's it for this video. Hopefully you guys liked it. Let us know down in the comments below if there are any decks that you think can make an impact in the Go Format World Championship Tournament, or any decks you feel like are likely, or just maybe pie in the sky sort of decks that you wish would come there and make a wave, and make an appearance in some way. So let us know what you think down below. Thank you for watching once again, and have a wonderful day, night, evening, wherever you are. I'll see you in the next one.